This section covers vehicle parking, Division 10.4 of the Denver Zoning Code, including parking calculations, reductions, design standards, and packed parking. This new provision in 10.422, maintenance of existing parking spaces, grants staff the authority to reduce the number of required parking spaces in an existing parking lot if its design with a reduced number of spaces substantially improves pedestrian or vehicle access or safety. The parking lot must still comply with the minimum parking area dimensional and design standards in Article 10. Staff must process this new type of zoning relief as an administrative adjustment per the AA procedure and review criteria stated in Article 12, including a mandatory pre-application meeting with the customer. This change in how parking requirements are calculated for a change of use simplifies that calculation by using a change in the amount of the use's gross floor area as the trigger for additional parking, as opposed to comparing the previous use's amount of parking required to the new required parking amount, and then determining whether there is a 25% increase with the change or expansion. The choice to go from comparing parking counts before and after the change of use to comparing the amount of gross floor area before and after was intended to reduce the number of calculations it takes to review plans requesting a change of use or an expansion. In C, additional parking of increment required revises the rule to match the shift to comparing gross floor area to gross floor area for determining if parking is required. The standard to park the increment of the increase is unchanged in that only the incremental increase in GFA above a 25% increase threshold requires parking to be provided. In other words, the parking exemption for the first 25% of an increase for an expansion remains in the code, but the change is to using GFA rather than the required parking amounts. When minimum parking is calculated based on the number of units, the change in the bundle is more of a clarification than a substantive change. Additional parking spaces are required only if the increase in the number of units after the expansion or change of use is greater than 25%. This compares the number of parking spaces required before and after, rather than looking at a change in the total GFA of the subject use before and after. When parking is based on GFA, the rule for a change of use generally remains the same as it was before the bundle in terms of exceptions for expansions. The requirement today is that the parking spaces that are required after a change of use or expansion above 125% of the previous use's requirement shall be parked, and then it gives an example of how the calculation would play out in a specific case. This addition clarifies and corrects current business practice to ensure that before and after parking amount calculation uses current code requirements for the number of parking spaces required, and there is no need to calculate the amount of parking for the previous use by looking back to the time that previous use was permitted. This section clarifies that when additional parking is required after an expansion or change of use, the entire off-street parking area, including existing spaces, must meet the code's minimum parking area layout and dimensional design standards in section 10.4.6. Generally, the code prioritizes maintaining previously established parking areas and spaces and ensuring that they meet the requirements for design and layout. Now, though, the bundle gives staff the discretion to reduce the total number of parking spaces required through the administrative adjustment process if that reduction would improve vehicle access or pedestrian safety in the redesigned parking lot. A great example of this might be a parking lot for a commercial strip where vehicles back into the right-of-way. When the change of use occurs, staff can allow a reduction in the number of spaces required in exchange for a safer configuration of the access to the parking lot. This change to the noticing requirements removes the exceptions for reductions via alternative parking ratios and the vehicle parking reductions for small lots in the CCN zone districts. The bottom line here is that all reductions greater than 25% will require a zoning permit review with informational notice. In terms of vehicle parking design, we've made a change to the requirement for protecting landscaped areas and pedestrian access ways. Previously, the code required that wheel stops be located so that no part of parked vehicles would extend more than 2 feet into any landscaped areas. For a clearer standard, we've replaced those references to vehicle overhang with a requirement to provide 2 feet of distance from curb stops to any landscaped areas and pedestrian walkways. For packed parking, we've added an option for staff to reduce the 150 square foot minimum parking space area when packed parking is achieved through a mechanized parking system. We've also removed the strict 23-foot width for an access lane. This gives staff discretion to review and allow narrower lane width for those access lanes if the applicant can show that it'll work.